France, 1943. A Gestapo officer leans across the interrogation table inches from a woman's face. Her body is shattered. 2 toenails ripped out, back scarred from beatings, spine damaged from torture. The officer smirks. He's seen this before. He knows what broken looks like. And this woman? She's broken, completely broken. That's what he thinks. That's what they all think. They call her broken, finished, used up. A spy who's been crushed under the weight of their torture. But here's what that officer doesn't know. Here's what none of them know. This woman is about to tell them the biggest lie of her life, and because they think she's broken, because they're so sure they've destroyed her will to resist, they're going to believe every single word. Her name is Odette Sansom. She's a British spy with 3 young daughters back home and absolutely zero training in how to withstand torture. And in the next few minutes, she's going to convince the entire German high command that she's connected to Winston Churchill himself. She's going to turn her captors' arrogance into a weapon. She's going to use their certainty that she's broken to sell them a lie so perfect, so completely believable, that it will save hundreds of Allied lives. They called her broken, but broken doesn't mean defeated. Sometimes broken is just another word for dangerous. This is the story of a mother who became a spy, a prisoner who outsmarted her torturers, and a woman who proved that the mind is the most powerful weapon you can have. The Nazis thought they'd destroyed her. They had no idea she was just getting started. Odette Sansom wasn't supposed to be a spy. Hell, she wasn't even supposed to be British. She was born French, married an Englishman, and ended up raising 3 little girls in London while German bombs fell from the sky. She was a housewife, a mother trying to survive the Blitz like millions of other women. But here's what makes her different, fellas. When opportunity knocked, she didn't hesitate. She didn't overthink it. She didn't make excuses. She just said yes. And that one decision changed everything. Let me tell you something, fellas. Most people go through life waiting for the perfect moment. Waiting until they're ready. Waiting until they have all the answers. Odette didn't wait. She saw a chance to make a difference, and she grabbed it with both hands. That's the kind of courage we're talking about here. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. And you're going to see exactly what that courage cost her. Odette Marie Céline Braley was born on April 28, 1912, in Amiens, France. Her childhood was marked by tragedy early on. When World War I broke out, her father was killed in action. Just like that, her mother was a widow, and little Odette grew up without a father. The war left scars on that entire generation, scars that never really healed. But her mother was tough. She raised Odette to be strong, to be independent, to never rely on anyone else to save you. That lesson would prove critical decades later. Odette grew up speaking French, naturally. But here's where it gets interesting. She developed a problem with her eyes, some kind of illness that left her partially blind for a while as a child. The doctors said she might never see properly again. They kept her in dark rooms for months, trying to protect what vision she had left. Can you imagine? A little girl, alone in the darkness, learning to navigate the world without her sight. But Odette didn't give up. She taught herself to see with her other senses, to listen more carefully, to feel her way through the world. And eventually her sight came back. But those skills she learned in the darkness? She never forgot them. In 1931, when she was 19 years old, Odette met an Englishman named Roy Sansom. He was handsome, charming, everything a young woman could want. They fell in love. She married him and moved to England, leaving France behind. She learned English, raised 3 daughters, Françoise, Lily, and Marianne, and settled into the quiet life of a British housewife. By 1939, she had everything she wanted. a husband, 3 beautiful girls, a home in London. Everything was perfect. Then Germany invaded Poland, Britain declared war, and suddenly nothing was perfect anymore. The Blitz began. German bombers filled the skies over London night after night. Odette would gather her daughters, rush them to the shelter, and pray they'd survive until morning. She heard the bombs fall, felt the ground shake, saw the fires burning across the city, and every night she wondered if this would be the night they didn't make it. But they did. They survived. And Odette started thinking about something bigger than survival. She started thinking about fighting back. Here's the thing about that generation, and maybe some of you remember this. When your country calls, you answer. You don't ask if it's convenient. You don't wonder if you're qualified. You just step up and do your part. That's what Odette did. And it started with something so simple it almost sounds ridiculous. She saw a newspaper advertisement, Spring 1942. Odette was reading the paper when she saw a notice from the War Office. They were looking for photographs of the French coastline for intelligence purposes. Anyone who had traveled to France recently was asked to submit any photos they might have. Odette had been to France. She had photos, but instead of just mailing them in, she wrote a letter. She explained that she spoke fluent French, knew the country well, and wanted to help in any way she could. It was a shot in the dark. A simple letter from a housewife who probably had no business volunteering for war work, but that letter landed on the right desk. It landed in front of a man named Selwyn Jepson. He was a recruiter for something called the Special Operations Executive, the SOE. You've probably heard of it if you're a history buff. It was Churchill's secret army, created to set Europe ablaze by conducting sabotage, espionage, and resistance work behind enemy lines. They were looking for agents to parachute into France, organize resistance networks, blow up railways, gather intelligence, and generally make life hell for the Nazis. And they needed people who spoke perfect French, people like Odette. Jepson called her in for an interview. He looked at this 30-year-old mother of 3 and saw something most people would have missed. She was calm, composed, unshakable. He asked her tough questions. She answered them without flinching. He explained what the job would actually involve: parachuting into occupied France, living under a false identity, risking capture, torture, execution. She listened to all of it. Then she said yes. But there was a problem, a big one. Odette had 3 young daughters. Françoise was 11, Lily was 8, Marianne was just 5 years old. How could she leave them? How could she risk never seeing them again? It's a question that haunts every parent who goes to war. But Odette made her choice. She believed that if she didn't fight now, her daughters would grow up in a world ruled by tyranny. She couldn't let that happen, so she made arrangements for the girls to stay with family, kissed each of them goodbye, and reported for training. The SOE training was brutal. They didn't go easy on anyone, man or woman. Odette learned hand-to-hand combat, how to kill silently with a knife, how to use explosives, how to operate a wireless radio, how to forge documents, how to live under a false identity without slipping up, how to withstand interrogation, and most importantly, how to lie convincingly. Because in the world of espionage, the best weapon isn't a gun or a bomb, it's information. And controlling information means controlling the truth. The training took place in various locations across Scotland and England. They'd wake the recruits at odd hours, force them through obstacle courses, in freezing rain, push them until they thought they couldn't go any further, then push them some more. The instructors were mostly former military, men who had seen combat and understood what it took to survive behind enemy lines. They looked at Odette, this 30-year-old French mother, and wondered if she had what it took. She showed them. During weapons training, she learned to field strip and reassemble a pistol in complete darkness. She learned to shoot accurately under pressure, with instructors firing blanks near her head to simulate combat conditions. She practiced with the small pistol she'd carry in France, a weapon that had to be concealed in a handbag or coat pocket. She learned where to aim for maximum effect. Center mass, they taught her, but also the back of the head, up close if it came to that. She practiced until her hands stopped shaking, until pulling the trigger felt as natural as turning a doorknob. The explosives training was conducted in remote areas where mistakes wouldn't kill civilians. They taught her about plastic explosives, detonators, timers, how to sabotage a railway line so it looked like an accident, how to destroy a bridge support so it would collapse under the weight of a German convoy, how to set charges that would go off hours after she was safely away. She learned to work quickly, efficiently, with cold hands in the dark, because that's how it would be in the field. But the hardest part wasn't the physical training. It was learning to become someone else. They gave her a new identity. Lise Metier, a widow from Normandy whose husband had died in the war. They created an entire backstory for her, where she was born, where she went to school, who her neighbors were, what her husband did for a living. She had to memorize every detail because if she was captured, the Gestapo would check everything. One inconsistency and her cover would collapse. They'd know she was a spy, and spies were executed. Odette practiced her cover story until she could recite it in her sleep. She learned to think like Lise Metier, to react like her, to forget temporarily that she was Odette Sansom, because hesitation could get you killed. If a German soldier asked your name and you paused for even a second, that pause could be fatal. Your false identity had to be as real to you as your actual identity, maybe more real. Odette struggled with some of the physical training. She wasn't a natural athlete, but what she lacked in physical strength, she made up for in mental toughness. Her instructors noted that she had an extraordinary ability to stay calm under pressure. She never panicked, never lost her cool. Even when they subjected her to mock interrogations, screaming in her face, threatening her, trying to break her, she remained steady. One instructor wrote in her file that she had an ice-cold mind. That assessment would prove accurate. They put her through scenario after scenario. Stopped her on the street, demanded to see her papers, asked trick questions designed to trip her up. She passed every test. They staged a mock arrest, dragged her out of bed in the middle of the night, threw her in a cold cell, and interrogated her for hours. She stuck to her story, never wavered, never broke character. The instructors were impressed. This woman, who had never done anything more dangerous than raise 3 children, had the temperament of a professional spy. By October 1942, Odette was ready, or as ready as anyone could be for what was coming. She was assigned to work with a network in France called SPINDLE, led by a man named Peter Churchill. Yes, that Churchill. Well, sort of. Peter Churchill was a British intelligence officer, but despite the name, he wasn't actually related to Winston Churchill, not even distantly. But the Nazis didn't know that, and that little misunderstanding was about to become very, very useful. On the night of November 2nd, 1942, Odette boarded a small fishing boat on the English coast. The plan was to land secretly on the French Riviera, near Cannes, and make contact with the local resistance. The sea was rough that night. The boat pitched and rolled. Odette, who had never been particularly fond of boats, spent most of the journey trying not to be sick. But when they reached the French coast, she was the first one over the side, wading through the cold water to the beach. She was back in France, but this time she wasn't a tourist. She was Lise Metier, A war widow with forged papers and a cover story that had to hold up under scrutiny. One mistake, one slip of the tongue, and she'd be dead. Let me pause here for just a second, folks, because I want you to think about what we're talking about. This woman left 3 young children at home, crossed the English Channel in the middle of a war, and walked into occupied France, knowing full well she might never come back. How many of us would have that kind of guts? How many of us would even consider it? I'm not saying you have to agree with every choice she made, but you have to respect the sheer courage it took to say yes to that mission. If you're finding this story as incredible as I am, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more people discover these forgotten heroes. And trust me, this story is just getting started. Odette made her way to Cannes and established contact with Peter Churchill. He was running the SPINDLE network, coordinating drops of supplies and weapons to resistance groups, gathering intelligence on German positions, and preparing for the Allied invasion everyone knew was coming eventually. Odette's job was to act as his courier, carrying messages between different resistance cells, gathering information, and helping to coordinate operations. It was dangerous work. The Gestapo was everywhere. Informers were everywhere. One wrong move, and the whole network could collapse. The French Riviera in 1942 was a strange place. The war seemed almost distant there. Rich collaborators still drank champagne in expensive hotels. German officers vacationed on the beaches. Life continued with an eerie normalcy that disguised the underlying terror. But beneath the surface, the resistance was growing. Networks were forming. Weapons were being cached. People were preparing for the day when they could fight back openly. Odette's arrival coincided with a critical time for the SPINDLE network. They had established contact with several resistance groups in the region, but coordination was difficult. Communication was slow and dangerous. Wireless operators risked their lives every time they transmitted to London because the Germans had direction-finding equipment that could locate radio signals. Couriers like Odette were essential. They carried messages that were too sensitive to risk over the radio. Orders from London, intelligence reports, coordination plans. All of it had to be hand-delivered. Her first mission as a courier was simple: deliver a message to a contact in Marseille. Peter gave her an address, a password, and a small envelope containing coded instructions. She took a train to Marseille, her heart pounding the entire journey. German soldiers patrolled the trains, checking papers, searching bags. She sat in her compartment, looking like any other French woman traveling for personal reasons. When a German officer entered her compartment, she smiled politely and answered his questions about where she was going. "Just visiting family," she said. He looked at her papers, nodded, and moved on. The envelope hidden in her coat pocket went undetected. In Marseille, she found the address: a small apartment above a bakery. She knocked, gave the password, and was led inside by a man she had never met and whose real name she would never know. She handed him the envelope. He thanked her, and she left. Mission accomplished. It seemed almost anticlimactic. But that's how most intelligence work actually is. Not dramatic gunfights or car chases. Just ordinary people doing dangerous things that look completely mundane. But Odette was good at it. Really good. She moved through the streets of southern France like she belonged there. She chatted with shopkeepers, smiled at German soldiers, played the part of a simple French woman trying to get by. No one suspected her. She carried coded messages hidden in her clothes, in her handbag, sometimes even in her mouth, ready to swallow if she was stopped. She memorized addresses, routes, safe houses. She never wrote anything down that could compromise the network. She developed techniques for spotting surveillance. She'd window shop, using the reflections to see if anyone was following her. She'd board a train at the last second, forcing any tail to reveal themselves by rushing to catch up. She'd vary her routes, never taking the same path twice in a row. These were survival skills, learned through practice and instinct. One mistake and she'd be arrested. One moment of carelessness and the entire network could be compromised. Peter Churchill quickly realized he had an exceptional agent on his hands. Most couriers were nervous, jumpy, always looking over their shoulders. Odette was different. She was calm, methodical, fearless. He began relying on her for more than just courier work. She became his second-in-command, helping to plan operations, recruit new agents, and coordinate with London. They worked together for months, building up the SPINDLE network across southern France. And somewhere along the way, something else happened. They fell in love. Now I know what you're thinking. A romance in the middle of a spy operation? Sounds like a bad movie, right? But this was real. Two people under incredible stress, living in constant danger, trusting each other with their lives every single day. It's not surprising they developed feelings, and those feelings would later become part of the lie that saved them both. By early 1943, the SPINDLE network was one of the most effective SOE operations in France. They had organized multiple resistance cells, coordinated dozens of supply drops, and gathered critical intelligence on German troop movements. But success brings attention, and the Gestapo was getting close. They had arrested several members of other SOE networks. Some had talked under torture, giving up names, addresses, radio codes. The Germans were closing in on SPINDLE. Peter and Odette knew it. They moved safe houses constantly, never staying in one place more than a few nights. They changed their routines, varied their routes, took every precaution. But it wasn't enough. April 16th, 1943. Peter and Odette were staying at the Hôtel de la Poste in Saint-Joriot, a small village in the French Alps. It was supposed to be a safe house, a place where they could lie low for a few days. They had separate rooms to maintain their cover, just two guests at a quiet mountain hotel. Nothing suspicious, but someone had talked. Someone had given them up. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Odette heard boots in the hallway. Heavy boots, German boots. She knew immediately what was happening. They had been betrayed. The Gestapo was here. She had maybe 30 seconds before they kicked down her door. 30 seconds to destroy anything that could compromise the network. She grabbed the radio codes, the maps, the lists of contacts, everything. She shoved them into the small stove in her room and lit a match. The papers caught fire. She watched them burn, making sure nothing was left. Then the door burst open. German soldiers flooded into the room, guns drawn, shouting in German. Odette stood there calmly, watching the last of the evidence turn to ash. She didn't run, didn't fight, didn't scream. She just stood there, ice-cold mind working through the options. She had been caught. That much was obvious. But the network could still be saved. If she played this right, if she told the right lies, everyone else might survive. They arrested her. Arrested Peter Churchill in the next room. Arrested several other members of the network who were in the hotel. They were loaded into trucks and driven to Gestapo headquarters in Annecy. And that's when the interrogations began. Now, here's where Odette's story becomes truly extraordinary. Because what happened next wasn't about physical strength or combat skills or weapons. It was about pure mental fortitude, about the ability to endure unimaginable pain and never, ever break. And I've got to warn you folks, what I'm about to describe is rough. The Gestapo didn't play nice, but understanding what Odette went through, what she survived, that's essential to understanding why she's a hero. The Gestapo wanted names. They wanted to know everyone in the SPINDLE network. Every safe house, every contact, every operation. They wanted radio codes so they could send false messages to London. They wanted everything, and they were willing to do anything to get it. The interrogations began immediately. Odette was taken to a room with bare walls, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a table with 2 chairs. The Gestapo officer who conducted the first interrogation was polite, almost friendly. He offered her a cigarette. She declined. He asked her name. She gave her cover name, Lise Metier. He asked what she was doing at the hotel. She said she was visiting a friend. He asked who the friend was. She gave Peter Churchill's cover name. The officer smiled. He didn't believe her, but he was patient. He had time. The questions went on for hours. The same questions, asked different ways, designed to catch her in a contradiction. What was her husband's name? Where did he die? What was the name of her street in Normandy? The name of her neighbor? Her childhood teacher? Every detail of her cover story was tested, and Odette passed every test because she had memorized it all. Every single detail. She knew Lise Metier's life better than she knew her own. When the polite approach didn't work, they changed tactics. The friendly officer was replaced by a harsher one. This man didn't offer cigarettes. He slammed his fist on the table, shouted in her face, called her a liar, a spy, a traitor to France. She sat there calmly, hands folded in her lap, and repeated the same answers. I am Lise Metier. I am visiting a friend. I know nothing about the resistance. The interrogator's face turned red with frustration. He wasn't getting anywhere. They started with questions, standard interrogation. Odette gave them nothing but her cover story. She was Lise Metier, a war widow. She didn't know anything about the resistance. She was just a friend of Peter Churchill. Nothing more. The interrogators didn't believe her, so they escalated. They brought in specialists, men whose only job was to extract information from prisoners. They had methods, psychological techniques designed to break down resistance. They'd leave her alone in a cold cell for days, then suddenly bring her back to the bright lights of the interrogation room. They'd deprive her of sleep, waking her every hour, keeping her disoriented and confused. They'd starve her, then offer food in exchange for just one name, just one piece of information. She refused every time. They told her that Peter Churchill had already confessed, that he had given up everyone in the network, that she was the only one left protecting people who had already betrayed her. It was a lie, of course. Standard interrogation technique. Make the prisoner feel isolated and abandoned, make them think their sacrifice is meaningless. Odette didn't fall for it. She knew their tricks. They showed her photographs of other captured agents, people she knew, and claimed they had all talked. Showed her transcripts of supposed confessions, all fabricated but convincing. They were testing her, trying to find a weak point. But Odette had no weak points, not ones they could exploit anyway. Her weakness was her daughters, but she'd never told the Gestapo about them. As far as they knew, Lise Metier had no children. That was one detail she had changed in her cover story, and it proved crucial. They couldn't threaten what they didn't know existed. When psychological methods failed, they moved to physical persuasion. And this is where Odette's ordeal became truly horrific. They beat her, punched her in the face, kicked her when she fell, slammed her head against the wall. Odette took it all without making a sound. She refused to cry out, refused to show weakness. Between beatings, they'd ask the same questions. She'd give the same answers. Nothing. When physical beatings didn't work, they moved to more sophisticated methods. They brought in a specialist, a man whose job was to extract information through torture. He looked at Odette like she was a problem to solve, a puzzle to break, and he had all the tools he needed. They burned her back with a red-hot poker. The smell of her own flesh burning filled the room. The pain was indescribable, but Odette didn't scream. She bit down on a piece of wood they'd given her and endured. When they asked for names, she said nothing. Then they moved to her feet. They pulled out her toenails, one by one, slowly, methodically, with pliers. The pain was so intense that Odette nearly passed out, but she didn't. She stayed conscious, stayed focused, and when they asked again for names, she looked them in the eye and said, "I have nothing to say." Can you imagine? Can you even begin to imagine that kind of strength? Most people would have broken in the first 5 minutes. Hell, most people would have told them everything just to make it stop. But not Odette. She understood something fundamental. If she talked, people would die. Good people, brave people who were fighting for freedom. She would rather die herself than be responsible for their deaths. So she endured. The torture continued for weeks. They tried everything. Starvation, sleep deprivation, more beatings, more burning. They told her that Peter Churchill had already confessed, that everyone else had given them up, that she was the only one left. All lies, of course, but convincing lies. Odette didn't fall for it. She knew their tricks, and she had a trick of her own. During one interrogation session, an officer mentioned Peter Churchill's name with particular interest. He called him Churchill, and Odette saw an opportunity. This is the moment, gentlemen. This is where everything hinges. She's been tortured. She's been broken down, or so they think. And now she's going to use that against them. She leaned forward, despite the pain, and said something that changed everything. She told them that Peter Churchill was Winston Churchill's nephew, not just any agent, not just another spy, family, direct family of the British Prime Minister. She said it with complete conviction, absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that can only come from telling a lie you know is brilliant. And here's the genius of it. Here's why it worked. They believed her because they thought she was broken. Think about it. If she still had fight in her, if they thought she was still resisting, they would have questioned everything she said. They would have assumed it was disinformation. But a broken prisoner, a woman who's been tortured for weeks and finally gives up information, that prisoner tells the truth. That's what they believed. That's what every interrogator believes. Break them enough, and the truth comes out. The Germans believed her. Why wouldn't they? Peter Churchill had the right name. He was clearly important, clearly well-connected. And Odette, this woman who had endured torture and appeared broken, had just confirmed it. They thought they had captured someone incredibly valuable, someone they could use as a bargaining chip. And if Peter was Churchill's nephew and Odette was his lover, then she was valuable too. The perception that she was broken made the lie credible. That's the con. That's the play. The torture stopped. Just like that. Not because they suddenly became nice, but because they realized that broken prisoners aren't useful for negotiations. They needed Odette alive and relatively intact if they were going to trade her later. Churchill's nephew's girlfriend? That was a valuable bargaining chip. You don't damage that. You preserve it. So they stopped trying to extract information and instead focused on keeping her alive. It was a calculation, a cold, brutal calculation. But it worked perfectly in Odette's favor. Let me spell this out, because this is important. The Gestapo stopped torturing her because they thought she was broken and had already given them valuable intelligence. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd cracked her. And that belief, that absolute certainty that they'd broken this British spy, that's what saved hundreds of lives. Because while they were patting themselves on the back for breaking her, the real work was happening. She had bought time, critical time. Time for the network to scatter. Time for the other agents to escape or go underground. Time for London to change the radio codes and relocate the safe houses. Time for every single person in the Spindle network to disappear into the French countryside. By the time the Gestapo realized the truth, if they ever did, it was too late. The Spindle network had dissolved. Everyone had vanished. The Germans had captured 2 agents but lost an entire network. Hundreds of resistance fighters lived because the Nazis thought Odette was broken. That's the deception. That's how one woman's lie saved hundreds of lives. Odette was transferred to Fresnes prison near Paris. It was a holding facility for political prisoners, a grim place where thousands of resistance fighters waited to learn their fate. Some would be executed, others would be sent to concentration camps. Odette spent months there in solitary confinement. No contact with other prisoners, no letters, no news from the outside world, just darkness and silence. But she wasn't idle. She used the time to strengthen her mind. She recited poetry she had memorized as a child. She replayed conversations with her daughters in her head, remembering every detail of their faces, their voices. She planned what she would say if she ever saw them again. She refused to let despair take hold, because despair is the real killer in solitary confinement. Despair is what breaks you when torture can't. In May 1944, Odette was told she was being transferred. She was put on a train with other female prisoners, all of them SOE agents or resistance fighters who had been captured. They were being sent east, to Germany, to a place whose name would become synonymous with evil, Ravensbrück concentration camp. Now, let me tell you something about Ravensbrück. It was a camp specifically for women. Over 130,000 women passed through its gates during the war. Tens of thousands never left. They died from starvation, disease, medical experiments, or execution. It was a place designed to strip away humanity, to reduce people to numbers, to break them completely. And this is where Odette would spend the next year of her life. She arrived at Ravensbrück on July 18, 1944. The SS guards processed her like cattle, shaved her head, stripped her of her clothes, gave her a rough prison uniform and a number. She was no longer Odette Sansom or Lise Metier. She was prisoner 83,692, just another number in a sea of numbers. But the guards had been given special instructions. This prisoner was connected to Winston Churchill. She was to be kept in solitary confinement, in the dark. The camp itself was a vision of hell on earth. Ravensbrück sat on the shore of a lake in northern Germany, surrounded by forests that should have been beautiful but instead felt oppressive and menacing. The camp was massive, containing thousands of women from across occupied Europe. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jews, Romani, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, anyone the Nazis deemed undesirable. They lived in overcrowded barracks, slept on wooden bunks infested with lice, and worked 12-hour days in factories producing materials for the German war effort. Odette saw all of this during her processing. She saw women who were nothing but skin and bones, barely able to walk. She saw guards beating prisoners for the smallest infractions. She saw the crematorium chimney, smoke rising constantly as bodies were disposed of. She understood immediately that this place was designed to destroy people, not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, through starvation and disease and brutality, through the systematic destruction of human dignity. But Odette wouldn't be in the general population. She was too valuable for that. The SS had special plans for her. They took her to a punishment cell, a tiny concrete box underground, no windows, no light, no bed, just a stone floor and darkness. They closed the door and locked it. And Odette was alone. Completely, utterly alone. In total darkness. For months. The cell was barely large enough to lie down in, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. The walls were damp. The floor was cold. There was a bucket in the corner for waste that was emptied once a day. That daily emptying was her only contact with another human being, and it usually consisted of a guard opening the door, swapping the bucket, and slamming the door shut again. No words, no acknowledgement that she was even human. The darkness was absolute, not the darkness of a room at night where your eyes adjust and you can make out shapes. This was complete absence of light. The kind of darkness where you hold your hand inches from your face and see nothing, where you lose all sense of space and time, where reality itself becomes questionable. This is the part of her story that gets me, folks. Because torture is one thing. You can grit your teeth and endure physical pain if you're strong enough. But this is psychological warfare. This is designed to destroy your mind, your sense of self, your sanity. Most people in solitary confinement start hallucinating within days, start losing track of time, of reality. Odette was down there for months, months in the darkness with nothing but her thoughts. But remember what I told you earlier about her childhood, when she lost her sight and learned to navigate the world in darkness? Those skills came back. She knew how to exist without seeing. She knew how to keep her mind sharp when her eyes were useless. She counted the seconds, the minutes, the hours. She exercised in the tiny space, keeping her body as strong as possible. She recited every poem, every song, every story she had ever known. She talked to herself, carried on conversations with imaginary people, anything to keep her mind active. The physical challenges were immense. Without any light, her body's natural rhythms collapsed. She couldn't tell day from night. Sleep became irregular, coming in fits and starts whenever exhaustion overtook her. The cold seeped into her bones. The damp air made her cough. The meager food they gave her, a piece of stale bread and thin soup once a day, wasn't enough to sustain her. She grew weaker, thinner. Her teeth began to loosen from malnutrition. Her hair, what little had grown back after they shaved it, fell out in clumps. But the mental challenges were worse. In the darkness, your mind plays tricks on you. You hear sounds that aren't there. You see lights that don't exist. You start to lose your sense of where your body ends, and the darkness begins. Odette fought against this constantly. She would touch the walls, feel the rough concrete under her fingers, reminding herself that she was real, that the world was real, that this was temporary. It had to be temporary. She couldn't allow herself to believe otherwise. She thought about her daughters constantly. Françoise, Lily, Marianne. She remembered their faces in perfect detail, the way Françoise's nose crinkled when she laughed, the way Lily hummed when she was concentrating, the way little Marianne would grab her hand and squeeze it 3 times, their secret code for "I love you." These memories sustained her. They gave her a reason to survive another day, another hour, another minute. The guards thought the darkness would break her. It didn't. If anything, it made her stronger. Because in that darkness, stripped of everything else, Odette discovered something fundamental about herself. She discovered that she was more than her body, more than her circumstances, more than the sum of what had been done to her. She was her will, her determination, her refusal to surrender. And those things couldn't be locked in a cell. They couldn't be tortured or starved or broken. They were hers, and hers alone. Hey, if you're still with me, I want to say thank you. These stories matter. These women deserve to be remembered. And if you're enjoying this, if you want to see more stories about forgotten heroes of World War II, hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to me and helps keep these stories alive. We've got so much more to cover, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next." While Odette was in solitary confinement, the world outside was changing. D-Day happened on June 6, 1944. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. France was being liberated piece by piece. The war was turning. Germany was losing. But inside Ravensbrück, none of that mattered. The killing continued. The suffering continued. And Odette continued to survive. Every few weeks, guards would pull her out of the cell for interrogation. Different officers, same questions. "Tell us about the resistance. Give us names. Help us, and we'll improve your conditions." She refused every time. She had endured torture in France. She had endured solitary confinement in Paris. She had endured the darkness of Ravensbrück. They had nothing left to threaten her with except death. And death didn't scare her anymore. One day, a senior SS officer visited her cell. He told her that she was going to be executed, not as punishment, but as an example. They needed to show the other prisoners what happened to spies. She was to be shot at dawn. The officer seemed almost apologetic about it, which was strange, coming from a man who had probably ordered thousands of executions. He asked if she had any last requests. Odette thought for a moment. Then she said she wanted to keep a small photograph of her daughters that she had managed to hide throughout her imprisonment. The officer granted the request. He left, and Odette waited for dawn. But dawn came and went. No execution. The guards brought her the usual starvation rations and left. She didn't understand what had happened. Had they changed their minds? Was it a cruel joke making her think she was about to die just to torture her psychologically? She didn't know. Days passed, then weeks. She was still alive, still in the dark, but alive. What Odette didn't know was that Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, had personally intervened. He believed the story about her being connected to Winston Churchill, and he was thinking about the future. The war was clearly lost. Germany was collapsing. Himmler was looking for bargaining chips, people he could use to negotiate with the Allies when the time came. A woman connected to Churchill? That was too valuable to waste on a firing squad, so he ordered her execution postponed. Indefinitely. Odette lived in that cell for months more, in the darkness, alone. She lost track of time completely. She didn't know what day it was, what month it was. She didn't know that Paris had been liberated, that American and British forces were pushing into Germany, that the Third Reich was in its final death throes. She only knew darkness and silence. Then, on April 28th, 1945, something changed. It was her 33rd birthday, though she didn't know it. She heard unusual sounds outside her cell, shouting, running, the sound of vehicles moving. Something was happening. The guards seemed panicked. Then her cell door opened. A guard stood there, silhouetted against the light that hurt her eyes after so many months in darkness. He told her to come with him. She thought this was finally it. They were going to execute her after all. But they didn't take her to the firing squad. They took her to an office, and there, sitting behind a desk, was a man she had never seen before. He introduced himself as Fritz Suren, the Commandant of Ravensbrück. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he said something she never expected to hear. He was releasing her. He was giving her a car, and he wanted her to drive him to the American lines so he could surrender. To her, specifically, because she was connected to Churchill, and he thought that might earn him some mercy. Odette couldn't believe it. This man, this monster who had presided over the deaths of tens of thousands of women, wanted her to save him. The irony was almost too much. She had been his prisoner for almost a year. Now he was asking her for help. She could have laughed if she had the energy, but she was also pragmatic. If saying yes got her out of that camp alive, she'd say yes. So she agreed. They put her in a car with Surin and another SS officer, and they drove west, toward freedom, toward the Allied lines, toward the end of the war. On May 3rd, 1945, they reached the American forces. Odette got out of the car, walked up to the first American soldier she saw, and identified herself as a British agent. She told them she had been a prisoner at Ravensbrück. She pointed at Surin and said, "This is the Commandant. He's your prisoner now." The Americans arrested Surin on the spot. Odette had delivered her own jailer to justice. And just like that, she was free. The Americans couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. This skeletal woman with haunted eyes and scars covering her body, who had just walked out of a concentration camp with the camp commandant in tow. They gave her medical attention, food, clean clothes. They contacted British intelligence. And slowly, Odette began to understand that it was over. The war was over. She had survived. She was flown back to England. On May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, Odette landed on British soil for the first time in more than 2.5 years. She had left as a spy on a dangerous mission. She returned as a survivor of Nazi torture and concentration camps, and the first thing she wanted to do was see her daughters. The reunion was emotional. Françoise, Lily, and Marianne had grown so much. They barely recognized their mother. She was thin, scarred, forever changed by what she had endured. But she was alive. Against all odds, she had come home. She held her girls and cried for the first time since her arrest. She had survived for them. Every moment of torture, every day in darkness, she had thought of them. And now she was home. The British government wanted to know everything. What had happened in France? What had she told the Gestapo? How much of the network had been compromised? Odette gave them a full debrief. She explained the torture, the lies she had told, the way she had protected the network by claiming Peter Churchill was related to Winston Churchill. The intelligence officers were amazed. That lie had been so effective, so perfectly executed, that it had not only saved lives, but had probably saved her own. And Peter Churchill? He had survived too. He had been sent to a different camp, but he had also been kept alive because the Germans believed he was valuable. The two of them had pulled off one of the most successful deceptions of the entire war, a complete lie, told under torture that the enemy never questioned. They reunited after the war. Their relationship continued for a while, but eventually they went their separate ways. The love that had sustained them during the war couldn't survive the peace. It happens. War bonds people in ways that peacetime can't replicate. But the British government wanted to honor what Odette had done. On August 20th, 1946, King George VI awarded her the George Cross, the highest civilian honor for gallantry in the United Kingdom. She was the first woman to receive it. The citation read in part, "She refused to abandon her French comrades and saved many lives by her refusal to speak. Her courage and devotion to duty were beyond praise." Let me read that again because it matters. Her courage and devotion to duty were beyond praise. Those aren't just words. That's the British government, known for its stiff upper lip and understatement, admitting that they couldn't find words adequate to describe what this woman had done. Think about that. Think about what it takes to earn that kind of recognition. She also received the French Légion d'honneur. The French knew what she had sacrificed for them. She had left her children, endured torture, spent a year in hell, all to help liberate their country. They would never forget it. But here's the thing about heroes, folks. The medals and the ceremonies, they're nice, they're important, but they don't erase the scars. They don't take away the nightmares. They don't make you forget the sound of your own screams or the smell of burning flesh. Odette carried those memories for the rest of her life. She struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though back then they didn't have a name for it. She had nightmares, she couldn't sleep in dark rooms, she flinched at loud noises. Simple things that most people take for granted, like walking down a street or sitting in a restaurant, could trigger panic attacks. She had survived the concentration camp, but part of her was still there. Always. Odette remarried in 1956 to Geoffrey Hallowees, another SOE veteran who understood what she had been through. They built a quiet life together in England. She didn't talk much about the war. She didn't want to be defined by it. She was more than her suffering, more than her torture, more than her medals. She was a mother, a wife, a woman who had lived through hell and chosen to live fully on the other side of it. But she never forgot, and she made sure the world didn't forget either. She gave occasional interviews, participated in documentaries, spoke at events honoring the SOE and the resistance. She wanted people to know what had happened, not for glory or attention, but because the truth matters, because the people who didn't make it back deserve to be remembered. And Fritz Suren, the man who had imprisoned her, the man she had driven to the American lines, he was tried for war crimes, convicted, and hanged in 1950. Justice came slowly, but it came. I want to take a moment here, folks, and talk about something that I think gets lost in these history lessons sometimes. We tell these stories about heroes and villains, about good and evil, about triumph and tragedy. And sometimes we forget that these were real people. Odette Sansom wasn't a character in a movie. She was a real woman who made real choices and suffered real consequences. She had fears and doubts and moments of weakness. She wasn't superhuman, she was human. And that's what makes her story so powerful. See, most of us will never be asked to do what Odette did. We'll never have to choose between our safety and someone else's life. We'll never have to endure torture or live in darkness for months. But we all face choices. Every day. Small choices that define who we are. Do we speak up when we see injustice? Do we help someone even when it's inconvenient? Do we do the right thing even when it costs us something? Those are the everyday versions of the choice Odette made, and her story reminds us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage. If you're finding value in this story, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. These stories need to be told, and your subscription helps make that possible. Plus, we've got more incredible stories coming your way. You won't want to miss them. Odette lived a long life after the war. She saw her daughters grow up, get married, have children of their own. She became a grandmother. She traveled. She laughed. She lived. But she also carried the weight of what she had experienced. In interviews later in life, she was asked how she had survived the torture, how she had endured the darkness, how she had kept from breaking. Her answer was always the same. She thought of her daughters. Every time the pain became unbearable, she pictured their faces. She imagined holding them again. And that gave her the strength to endure one more second, one more minute, one more day. She also said something else that stuck with me. She said that the Gestapo could control her body, but they could never control her mind. They could torture her flesh, but her thoughts were her own. They could lock her in darkness, but they couldn't extinguish the light inside her. That's where the real battle was fought. Not in the interrogation rooms or the prison cells, but in her own mind. And she won that battle every single day. There's a lesson there for all of us. We can't always control what happens to us. Life throws things at us. illness, loss, betrayal, failure, things we never asked for and don't deserve, but we can control how we respond. We can choose to give up or keep fighting. We can choose despair or hope. We can choose to break or to bend. Odette chose to bend. She bent so far that everyone thought she would snap, but she never did. She sprung back, scarred, damaged, but unbroken. Odette Sansom died on March 13th, 1995, at the age of 82. She had lived 50 years beyond the war, 50 years of peace that she had helped secure. The obituaries called her a war hero, a symbol of British courage, the bravest of the brave. And all of those things were true. But they missed something essential. She was also a mother who made an impossible choice. A woman who learned that strength isn't about being unafraid. It's about being terrified and doing it anyway. A prisoner who discovered that the strongest chains are the ones we forge in our own minds. And the key to freedom is refusing to accept defeat. She was proof that the human spirit, properly motivated and utterly determined, can endure things that seem impossible. Her story raises questions that I think about a lot. What would we do in her position? Would we have the courage to say yes when the opportunity came? Would we endure the torture without breaking? Would we tell the lie that could save lives? I'd like to think I would. But honestly, I don't know. I've never been tested like that, and I hope I never am. But I'm grateful that there were people like Odette who were tested and didn't flinch, who stood up when it mattered most, who paid the price so the rest of us could live in freedom. Think about this, gentlemen. Odette was captured in April 1943. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. That's just over 2 years. In that time, she endured torture, solitary confinement, a concentration camp, months in total darkness, starvation, disease, and the constant threat of execution. 2 years of hell, and she never broke, never gave up a single name, never compromised the mission. She protected people she had never met, people who would never know her name, people who owed their lives to her silence. That's heroism, pure, undiluted heroism. And here's what really gets me. After the war, Odette didn't want special treatment. She didn't write a memoir trying to cash in on her fame, though she could have. She didn't go on a speaking tour or become a celebrity. She just wanted to go home to her daughters and live a normal life. The medals were nice. The recognition was appreciated. But what she really wanted was the thing the war had taken from her. Time with her children, a quiet life, peace. And eventually, she got it. Not the way she had hoped, not without scars, but she got it, and she made the most of it. You know what impresses me most about her story? It's not the torture she endured. It's not the concentration camp she survived. It's not even the lie she told that saved so many lives. It's the fact that she volunteered in the first place. She could have stayed home. She could have justified it a dozen different ways. She had 3 young children who needed her. She was a woman in her 30s with no military training. She could have sent the photographs to the War Office and gone on with her life. No one would have blamed her. But she didn't. She saw an opportunity to make a difference, and she took it. Knowing the risks, knowing the odds, she took it anyway. That's the choice that started everything. That's the moment that defined her life. Not the torture or the imprisonment or the medals. The moment she decided to act. The moment she stopped being a passive observer and became an active participant in the fight for freedom. We all have those moments. Maybe not as dramatic, maybe not as dangerous, but moments when we can choose to act or to walk away. Odette's story reminds us that those choices matter, that one person can make a difference. That courage isn't reserved for soldiers or spies or superheroes. It's available to anyone willing to pay the price. Let me tell you about some of the other people in her story, because Odette didn't act alone. There was Peter Churchill, her fellow agent and the man who unknowingly became her alibi. He spent the war in Sachsenhausen concentration camp, kept alive because the Germans believed he was Winston Churchill's nephew. After the war, he wrote several books about SOE, operations in France. He never took credit for the deception about his name. That was all Odette, but he honored her courage and her sacrifice in everything he wrote. There was Selwyn Jepson, the recruiter who saw something special in a housewife's letter and gave her a chance. He recruited more than 400 agents for the SOE during the war, many of them women. He believed that women made excellent spies because people underestimated them. No one suspects a woman. And he was right. The female agents of the SOE carried out some of the most daring and successful operations of the entire war. There were the other women at Ravensbrück, prisoners whose names we'll never know, who showed kindness to Odette when they could, who whispered encouragement through the walls, who shared their meager rations, who reminded her that she wasn't alone. Solidarity in suffering. It's one of the few things that makes hell bearable. And those women, faceless and nameless to history, were part of Odette's survival. And there were her daughters, Françoise, Lily, and Marianne. They grew up without their mother for years. They didn't know if she was alive or dead. They just knew she had gone away to fight in the war. Can you imagine what that was like for them? Waiting, hoping, praying. And when she finally came home, she was different, damaged, haunted, but still their mother. They loved her through the nightmares and the panic attacks. They learned to live with the silence when she couldn't talk about what had happened. They gave her a reason to keep going when everything else had been taken away. Folks, we're coming to the end of this incredible story, but before we wrap up, I want to ask you something. If you've made it this far, if you've stuck with me through this entire journey, then you clearly value these stories. You understand why they matter, so please, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These stories of courage and sacrifice deserve to be remembered, and your engagement helps ensure they reach more people. Do it for Odette. Do it for all the forgotten heroes who never got their due. Do it so their courage isn't lost to history. Now, there's one more thing I want to talk about before we finish. It's the question that haunts every story like this. What happened to the people who betrayed her? Because someone did betray her. Someone gave the Gestapo the address of that hotel in St. Joriot's. Someone sold out the Spindle network. Who was it? For years, that question remained unanswered. There were suspicions, theories, accusations. Some people thought it was a local informer who had noticed something suspicious. Others believed it was a double agent within the resistance. The truth, when it finally came out, was somehow both more mundane and more tragic. It was a man named Roger Bardet, a member of the French resistance who had been arrested and turned by the Gestapo. He wasn't evil. He wasn't a Nazi sympathizer. He was just a man who broke under torture and agreed to work for the enemy to save his own life. He gave up the Spindle network. He gave up Odette and Peter. And then he lived with that guilt for the rest of his life. After the war, Bardet was tried for treason. He was convicted and sentenced to death. But the sentence was later commuted to life in prison. He served several years and was eventually released. He disappeared from public life, a broken man haunted by what he had done. Some people say Odette forgave him. Others say she never spoke of him at all. I don't know which is true, but I know this. Roger Bardet made a choice under torture that Odette refused to make under the same circumstances. He chose his own life over the lives of his comrades. She chose the opposite. That's the difference between breaking and bending. That's the difference between a traitor and a hero. I'm not telling you this to judge Bardet. I wasn't there. I don't know what he went through. Maybe I would have done the same thing in his position. Maybe you would have too. But the contrast is important, because it shows that Odette's choice to stay silent wasn't inevitable. It wasn't the only option. Other people chose differently. She chose to endure, and that choice saved lives. So what's the takeaway from all this? What are we supposed to learn from Odette Sansom's story? Here's what I think. We're living in soft times, gentlemen. Most of us have never experienced real hardship, never gone hungry, never faced death, never been tortured, never had to make choices where someone's life hangs in the balance. And that's a good thing. That's progress. That's what people like Odette fought for, so we wouldn't have to. But soft times can make soft people. We get comfortable. We forget what real courage looks like. We think bravery is posting a controversial opinion online or standing up to a rude customer. And sure, those things take a certain kind of courage. But they're not the same. Not even close. Odette's story reminds us what real courage looks like, what real sacrifice demands, what real strength requires. She volunteered knowing she might die. She endured torture knowing she could make it stop with a single word. She spent months in darkness knowing she might never see light again. She did all of that for people she didn't know, for a cause larger than herself, for the belief that some things are worth more than survival. That's a level of courage most of us can't even comprehend. But we can honor it. We can remember it. We can tell the story so it's not forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, we can let it inspire us to be a little braver in our own lives. Not war hero brave, just everyday brave. Stand up for what's right even when it's uncomfortable. Help someone even when it's inconvenient. Speak the truth even when lying would be easier. Make the hard choice even when the easy choice is right there. That's how we honor Odette's legacy. Not with statues or monuments, though those are nice, but by living with a little more courage ourselves. I want to end with something Odette said in one of her last interviews. She was in her 80s by then, looking back on a long and full life. The interviewer asked her if she considered herself a hero. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "No, I was just a woman who saw something that needed doing and did it. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home." That's who she was. A woman who did what needed to be done. A mother who left her children to fight for their future. A prisoner who refused to break. A spy who pulled off the con of the century. A survivor who carried her scars with dignity. A hero who never accepted the title. Odette Sansom Hallowe's. Remember that name. Remember her story. Remember what she sacrificed. Remember what she proved. That the human spirit, when pushed to its absolute limit, can endure anything. That courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about being afraid and doing it anyway. That sometimes the strongest weapon isn't a gun or a bomb. It's a perfectly told lie delivered with absolute conviction. That one person making one choice can save hundreds of lives. Look, I want to come back to this idea because it's at the heart of everything. They called her broken. The Gestapo officers who tortured her, they were certain they'd shattered her. They wrote reports about it, documented their success. This prisoner has been broken, information extracted, case closed. The Commandant at Ravensbrück thought the months in darkness would destroy her mind, turn her into a shell. Even some of her own people after the war looked at her and assumed she must be damaged beyond repair, too broken to ever be whole again. But they were all wrong, every single one of them. She wasn't broken, she was bent, tested, scarred, absolutely, but never, ever broken. You know what the difference is, fellas? Broken means you can't function anymore. Broken means you quit. Broken means you let them win. Odette did none of those things. She bent under the pressure, sure. Any sane person would. But bending isn't breaking. Bending is survival. Bending is adapting. Bending is staying alive long enough to fight another day. And when the test was over, she stood back up. She went home to her daughters. She lived her life. She proved every one of them wrong. And, gentlemen, that's the story of Odette Sansom Hallowes, a British housewife who became a spy, a mother who became a warrior, a prisoner who outsmarted the Gestapo, a woman they called broken who was anything but. She showed the world that courage has no gender, strength has no limits, and the human spirit, properly motivated, is absolutely indestructible. They thought breaking her body would break her mind. They were wrong. Her mind was her weapon, and she used it to save hundreds of lives while her torturers congratulated themselves on breaking her. That's not just survival, that's victory. If this story moved you, if it inspired you, if it made you think about courage and sacrifice in a new way, then please share it. Tell someone else. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Because there are more stories like this, more forgotten heroes, more incredible acts of courage, more reminders of what humanity is capable of when pushed to the edge. And I'm going to keep telling them as long as you keep listening. Thank you for your time. Thank you for caring about history. Thank you for honoring these heroes by learning their stories. Stay brave, stay strong, and I'll see you in the next one.